I'm assuming there was a microphone supposed to be up here, but I can't find it, so I'm just going to talk really loud. If that works. So it's about the fall of this past year where my family and I took a vacation, and we went up to Glacier National Park. And if you ask Tad and Kathy, they can corroborate the story I'm about to tell you. But as we began our trip, our truck looked like this. It was nice and clean, everything was bright and shiny. We had gotten it all spiffy for the trip. And once we got to Glacier National Park up in Montana, there was some road construction that was going on. And it was, a little bit rainy, not too terribly rainy, but there was some water in what was basically just a mud puddle in the middle of the road in Glacier National Park. And there were cars going single file through the mud puddle as slow as they could possibly go. And when we got to the mud puddle, I gunned it. And we threw mud all over the truck. Tad was, I think, in the back at the time, and he was just laughing up a storm as we were throwing mud all over the place. And isn't that kind of how our lives tend to go sometimes? Where we could take the reasonable approach, we could take the sensible approach, or we could go too far. We could go to the extreme. And that's kind of how we approached this mud puddle that day, was going to the extreme, just covering every last bit of the truck in mud. And it's interesting because this time of year, December 31st, is where I think a lot of people who preach lessons are considering ways of inspiring people into the new year, right? A lot of people are going to talk about different ways of setting goals and getting motivated. One of the big things, though, that a lot of people do around this time of year is they set resolutions, right? They set intentions for themselves, they set goals, and a lot of those goals tend to focus around health. They tend to focus around things like food. And so what I want to talk with you all just for a little bit this morning is the idea of gluttony. Gluttony is something the Bible actually talks quite a bit about. And I know we don't really have a lot of conversations from the pulpit about gluttony, but the idea here that we're going to explore this morning is that gluttony is like taking the truck and gunning it through the mud puddle. Gluttony is the idea of going to the extreme. It's the idea of going too far. And where we're really going to be talking about food for a while this morning, I think what we're going to see in our study throughout the Bible is that the idea of gluttony, as it's talked about in the New Testament, is more so about going to the excess, is about going too far in our lives. And actually, that's where we get to this verse that we read, that Brother Tad read earlier, and it was this idea about being too much from Matthew chapter 11. And in verse 19, this is again when Jesus is confronted by the disciples of John the Baptist, and they're trying to figure out who Jesus is. Jesus, are you who you say you are? And he goes on to talk there in verse 8 or in verse 18 about how John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking. He was out in the wilderness. He was wearing all kinds of funny clothing, out there camping, out there eating bugs. And they said he has a demon. But the Son of Man, as he said here, came eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton, a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, yet wisdom is justified by her deeds. We're going to highlight this word here that he uses, this word glutton. This word glutton is very important because Jesus is being accused of going too far. He's being accused not of eating too much, but he's being accused of eating with the wrong kinds of people, He's being accused of going too far in his connections with other people. They're throwing this as an accusation at Jesus. And so as we start thinking about this idea of gluttony, it's easy for us, by the way, to focus on the other word, drunkard. I think we all get that idea, the idea of being a drunkard, what they're accusing him of. But what is this word gluttony all about? What is Jesus being accused of here? And how can we learn some lessons about that this morning? Well, as I like to do sometimes, it's easy to go to the Greek definitions of these words, because Jesus here is using this word, and it's translated in his day as this Greek word phagos. And the word is literally just translated as glutton, and it's used here in Matthew chapter 11. It's also used in the parallel account to this in Luke chapter 7, verse 34. Now, if you just stop right there and you say, okay, well, what does this Greek word phagos mean? Well, it means gluttony. But that doesn't really tell you a whole lot more. You don't really get a lot more information from this word. And so what's helpful sometimes is for us to go back and look at when this Greek word is also used back in the Old Testament. Now, hold on. The Old Testament was written in what language? Hebrew, right? But during Jesus' day, they had translated the Old Testament into Greek so that they could read it among Greek speakers at the time. And so that's called the Septuagint translation. And so there's this word phagos is actually used back in the Old Testament as well. And this word that's translated as glutton back in the Old Testament in the Hebrew is this word zalal. Okay. So we're making some connections. Now we're going to go back to the Old Testament, and we're going to look at this word zalal. Zalal is used, and it's often defined as to be loose, morally worthless, or prodigal. Like the prodigal son who went and lived wastefully. Glutton, riotous eater, or vile. And there's a verse that's really helpful, I think, in understanding what this word is all about. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 21. And this is when Moses is trying to get the people to understand what they're supposed to do about a young man who's living a riotous lifestyle. It says in verse 18 of Deuteronomy chapter 1, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, though they discipline him and they will not listen to him, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him, bring him out to the elders of the city at the gate of the place where he lives, and they shall say to the elder of this city, this is our son. He is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Okay, so just so we're all on the same page, a lot of times when you see this word gluttony in the Bible, it's tied to another word, the word drunkard. We saw that in Matthew 11. Now we're seeing that here in Deuteronomy chapter 21. Glutton and drunkard are often connected with each other. And what he's saying here is this young man is going to the extreme in his life. He's living prodigally. He's out there just living wastefully. And so we see how this word is also used in many other places throughout the Proverbs specifically. The wise writer in Proverbs has a lot to say about eating and this idea of gluttony. There's a verse in Proverbs 21, there's a verse in Proverbs 28 talking about this idea of gluttony. We're not going to go through and look at all of those. But you get this sense, you get this idea that this word is about gluttony. And it's actually this word in Proverbs chapter 28, verse 7. In Proverbs 28, verse 7, this word that's translated, this word zalal. So here's what's going to get interesting. Proverbs chapter 28, verse 7. The wise writer says, the one who keeps the law is a son with understanding, but a companion of gluttons shames his father. All right, so this word here is actually a word that we see used later on. Because this word gluttony in the Old Testament is used in the New Testament a lot. And it's this word asotia. Asotia is this word that in the New Testament is also tied to this word gluttony. And this is the word that's described as luxury, recklessness, dissipation, wildness, debauchery, and wastefulness. So another word back here in the Old Testament used as translated as gluttony. Now if you go back to the New Testament where we started this conversation, that word shows up all over the place. So when Jesus was described as being a glutton, that particular word is only used twice in the New Testament. We went back to the Old Testament, and now we're back in the New Testament, and we're finding out that this word, that the people of Jesus' day also translated or believed was gluttony, this is the word for luxury, recklessness, and wasteful living. This is a big deal. Ephesians chapter 5 is actually a really good place to look at this. In Ephesians chapter 5, this word is the word that's used here, and we'll look at it here. He says, do not get drunk with wine. Okay, there we go again. Do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. So this idea of debauchery, this idea of wastefulness, that's what's going on here when we're talking about gluttony. It's about going too far. It's not always talking specifically about food, but food is definitely involved in it. It's about going too far. It's about living recklessly. And so let's talk here for just a second as we discuss what is too much. How do we avoid the trap of excessive living? In 2024, looking forward to the future, how do you make sure you're not living excessively? How do you make sure you're not going too far in your spending? How do you make sure you're not going too far in your eating? How do you make sure you're not going too far by how much time you spend on social media or on your phone? How do you make sure that you're not going too far? And so, as we talk about gluttony, really we're talking just about being reasonable, not going too far, not going to the extreme. Here is what we're not talking about, just really quickly, because I know right now you kind of get this sense that maybe we're talking about some things that I want to clear up that we're not talking about. We're not talking about sharing our meals together. Okay? When the Bible talks about gluttony, the Bible is not forbidding us to share our meals with each other. You remember back in that passage in Matthew 11, verse 19, you remember what Jesus said about his ministry? He said, the Son of Man came what? Eating and drinking. Now, if Jesus had anything bad to say about eating and drinking, he would have said it right there. And he would not have described his entire ministry as the Son of Man came eating and drinking. There's nothing wrong with sharing a meal with your loved ones, with your friends, with people you don't know. There's nothing wrong with that. So as we talk about gluttony, let's just be really clear that we're not talking and we're not saying that we shouldn't have our meals together, because that is important. The idea of eating in the Bible, the idea of sharing that together, it's just part of who we are. So that's not what we're talking about necessarily. We're also not talking about this as one of the quote-unquote 7 deadly sins. By the way, you know that word is not, that phrase, that idea even, is not in the Bible. That's a man-made idea, this idea of the 7 deadly sins that people came up with. And one of those, by the way, Tad, you said that Google knows a lot during our Bible class. And if you do Google search gluttony, you will find article after article after article about gluttony as one of the 7 deadly sins. It's not, and that's not even a thing. So let's just be clear about that. We're talking about something that is something we need to confront and address in our own lives, but it's not a quote-unquote deadly sin, whatever that means. It also doesn't mean that we need to change our lunch plans today. As we talk about gluttony, as we talk about eating too much, and what we're discussing here in this, you don't need to go out today and have a salad. I'm not expecting that from anybody. But I think we do need to take seriously our ability to overindulge in things. That's really going to be the focus here in our conversation. I think what's helpful is for us to go back. If you were in Proverbs, go back to Proverbs chapter 30. We're going to kind of use this idea in Proverbs 30 as kind of a launching off point for this conversation. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 7. This is not the wise rider as in Solomon. This is the wise rider as in a man named Agur, the son of Jacob, the oracle. This proverb, Proverb 30, is written by a different guy than pretty much the rest of the Proverbs. This is a guy named Agur. And he has this request, which is really powerful, I think. He says, 2 things I ask of you. Deny them not to me before I die. It's like his dying request. Lord God, remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. So you see what Agur is doing there. He's saying, make sure that I don't lie and say things that are untrue. That's request number 1. Request number 2 is kind of this idea of, God, give me enough so that I have what I need, but don't give me so little that I'm poor. So he's kind of asking to have the scale or the balance swing right in the middle. Because if I'm too far in the poverty spectrum, I might be tempted to steal. But if I'm so full that I'm fat and I'm happy, I might be tempted to what? Forget about you. And so this idea, this request from Agur, I think is really a helpful idea when we're talking about gluttony. Now, we could talk about the poverty part of this, and maybe we will someday. But this morning I'd like to focus here on his request about the riches and the fatness that he's asking God to keep him away from. Because he wants God to feed him with the food that is needful for him, lest he be full. There's a problem Agur realizes with being full. Have you ever been full? You ever stepped away? You ever have to wear your sweatpants to the dinner because you know this would be a hard lesson to preach the week of Thanksgiving, right? Because all of us know that kind of idea. Probably many of us know this idea of eating too much and just the idea of being full. And what Agur is asking God is to please, Lord, let me not be excessive in the way that I live. And so here's the big idea in this lesson. Gluttony, excess, and luxurious living pose a massive threat to our spiritual well-being. That's the problem. Food, yes, food is a problem, but so many other things we could be gluttonous and excessive and debaucherous with in our life. So many other things we could go too far in. And this idea of excess, it really does distract us from our purpose. As Agur is talking about there in that proverb, right? If I'm too full, what am I going to do? I'm going to forget about you, God. And so, let's look at the idea. What is wrong with too much? Because when I was in college, when I was a college kid, and you were you didn't have a lot of extra money. You were sort of eating ramen all the time, and you kind of had to skimp by. And the idea of having too much when you have very little seems like the ideal. I wish someday I'd just have so much. But that's a problem with regard to our spiritual lives and our physical lives. What is wrong with too much? Well, as we just read there from Agur, it leads us to forget about God. Because that's what he was asking there. He says, I know, Lord, if I have too much, if I'm too full, I'll forget about you. Well, why is that? Notice here in Deuteronomy chapter 31, we'll put the verse on the board there, but Deuteronomy 31, verses 19 through 20, Moses says, For when I have brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to give to their fathers, and they have eaten and are full and have grown fat, they will turn to other gods and serve them and despise me and break my covenant. This is Moses speaking on behalf of God. And God is basically telling people, I'm going to give you the land flowing with milk and honey. I'm going to bring you into this amazing place, and what's going to happen to you? You're going to eat, you're going to get fat, you're going to get full, and then what's going to happen? They will turn to other gods and serve them. Isn't that exactly what happened? Now hold on. Who is the one who gave the children of Israel the milk and the honey? Who is the one who gave the children of Israel this amazing land of bounty? It was God. So doesn't God want them to be happy? Doesn't God want them to have everything that they could possibly want? No. God doesn't want everyone to just get full and fat to the point where they forget about him. And he knows that's a possibility. Because we can rely too much on ourselves, we can become too self-sufficient, and this idea of luxurious living makes it feel like I'm the one accomplishing things. When I'm the one who brings in the bacon, and I'm the one who provides for my family, and I'm the one who gets to enjoy life's blessings, we forget that God is in charge, that God is in control. And we need to be really careful with that, because there were a lot of people even in Jesus' day who forgot about that same thing. I'm thinking of the rich young ruler who was unwilling to sell all of the possessions that he had and give the proceeds to the poor because he felt so self-sufficient that he had come to all of these things himself. And so it leads us to forget about God, but it also fosters a worldly focus. That's one of the big problems of excess. That's one of the big problems of gluttony, is because it helps us start to look around us and see the world as being so important, more important than it is. Philippians chapter 3, verse 19, Paul says this: their end is destruction. Their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things. Isn't that exactly what we're talking about? Their God is their belly. And when you think about somebody who is gluttonous, he's not talking here, by the way, about people who eat too much. He's talking here about people who feel like they are more important than God. People who feel like their opinions, their priorities are more important than God's. And so it does foster a worldly focus and helps misguide us. It really changes our focus to this world and not on God. But gluttony also, and this idea of excessive living, it also leaves us feeling empty, which kind of sounds counterintuitive, right? What do you think of when you think of being fat and full and having enough? You don't think of emptiness. But if you've ever had a really big meal, how quickly after that are you hungry again? I think God made us that way, right? God made us that way so that we could enjoy a really big meal, and then, not like 10 hours later, we're starving again. He's reminding us, I think, that we need to rely on him. But even in all these things, having too much, going too far, can really leave us feeling empty. And it's something we need to be very careful about in our life. But it also wastes what other people could use. And that was really the idea that we read about from John the Baptist himself. Remember when John the Baptist was trying to teach his audience, teach his hearers about how to repent and come to the knowledge of Jesus. He answered them, whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none, and whoever has food is to do likewise. So if you have too much, if you have an excess, what are we supposed to do with that excess? Not keep it, not hoard it for ourselves, but share it with other people. And that idea of having too much and just using all of our resources without sharing it with others, that can be a real problem for us. It's just a couple of reasons why going to the extreme and living excessively is a problem. But what do we do about it? How do we avoid too much? Because let's just be honest about it. We live in America. And I know we're not all like driving Maseratis in the parking lot, and we're not pulling into our multi-million-dollar homes, most of us. But I know for sure, according to a lot of the standards of living in a lot of other places in this world, we are very rich. We are very blessed. No matter where we are, if we live in America, we are absolutely blessed. And so we need to understand that we've got a real challenge facing us every day about too much. One of the things we need to do, as we read from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18, one of the things we need to do is pray to the Lord God that he would fill us with his Spirit. That's one of the most important things we can do, because as he says here, Paul says in Ephesians 5 verse 18, do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, that word again that we're looking at, gluttony, but be filled with the Spirit. We need to fill ourselves with the Spirit. We need to make sure that we are, yes, studying our Bibles, rather than filling ourselves up with food and drink, that we're filling ourselves with good things, with helpful things, that we're making sure that we're allowing the Lord's will to permeate our lives, and that we're not doing the things we want to do, but we're just following in Jesus' footsteps every day. We need to make sure that we have a different motivation, a different why. That's why I think maybe this lesson is helpful for the turn of the new year. If we can replace our desires with the Spirit's desires, that really changes the game in how we live. And, maybe that won't cause us to put down the cheeseburger, but maybe it should. Maybe it should cause us to think seriously about our lives, think seriously about how we're going too far if we are. And we also need to make sure that we discipline ourselves. That really is one of the biggest problems that we need to address. We need to discipline ourselves. And self-discipline is not easy. Whatever your quote-unquote vice is, we need to make sure that nothing dominates our lives aside from Jesus. And that is, I think, what Paul was getting at in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 12 to 13, Paul is talking about himself. He says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. And then he uses this phrase, and it sounds like he's talking about gluttony, but we'll talk about why he's not in a second. He says, food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach is for the food, and God will destroy both, one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but the Lord, and the Lord for the body. What Paul's about to do here is talk about sexual immorality and how we should keep our bodies pure. But what does he do to help explain that, or to help sort of use a metaphor for that so we can understand it? He uses the metaphor of food. Our bodies are not designed so that we can eat. We're not just completely driven by food, but it says food is meant for the stomach and the stomach is for the food. So these two things are meant to go together. They're meant to supplement each other and help each other out. But he says God's going to destroy both of these. The body, our stomachs, and the food, both of these things will be burned up. So what he's really talking about is sexual immorality, making sure our bodies are kept pure. But the phrase that he uses there is that I will not be dominated by anything. And that's important. Sometimes we say, or sometimes we might say, well, I just couldn't help myself. When it came to a meal, when it came to online shopping, when it came to, scrolling through your phone, looking at Facebook or whatever it is you're doing, you might say, I just couldn't help myself. Well, you know what? Paul was very serious about not letting anything dominate his life. He needed to discipline himself, and we need to do the same thing. We need to take control of our lives. And that's a challenge, when especially we are tempted to go too far or to do too much. As we talked about there from Proverbs 30, I think we need to be content with enough. And that's hard, because we always want more, right? We're always pushing forward. We're always trying to get more, acquire more. That's why there's shows on TV about hoarders, right? Because all they want to do is just acquire and collect. And that's a problem when it comes to our spiritual lives, because God has given every person what they needed. You remember in Matthew chapter 6, verse 11? What does Jesus say in this prayer? This model prayer that he's giving us. He says, give us this day our what? Our daily bread. And that points us back to this story in Exodus 18, Exodus 16, when he's talking about the manna that came down from heaven. Do you remember in that story? When the manna came down from heaven, how long did that manna last? One day. And if they tried to collect it, if they tried to hoard it, they tried to put it in baskets and keep it for the next day, what was going to happen to that manna, that bread from heaven? It was going to mold and spoil. And what God was training his people to do is to trust him. That God is going to provide, God is going to take care of you, and that you don't need to worry about doing that on your own. And that means we need to be content with enough. What is enough? What is the right amount for you? What has God blessed you with? And be content with that. Be happy with that. And really, I think that leads into the final point here, is that we need to find satisfaction in the Lord. Because finding satisfaction in earthly things, in online shopping, or in social media, or even in food, it might feel good at the time. Just like it felt really good to drive through that mud puddle as fast as possible and spray mud everywhere. You know what happens? In the moment, sin feels really good. But is that going to lead to lasting satisfaction? You know what we eventually had to do? We had to clean the truck. And then we washed the truck like 3 times to get all the mud off of it, and there was still mud on the truck after we were done. Eventually, it just leads to sadness. It doesn't lead to lasting satisfaction. And that is what the psalmist is talking about in Psalm 73, where the psalmist says, "Nevertheless, I am continually with you. You hold my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, and afterward you will receive me to glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on the earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." What the psalmist knows is that nothing on earth will ever satisfy him more than God. And so when we're talking about gluttony, when we're talking about food, this applies. God satisfies us. Not our physical lives, not our food, not our stuff, not the things that we enjoy in this life. No, God satisfies us. Remember, as Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they will be satisfied." Those who hunger and thirst. I think there's a specific reason why Jesus is using hungering and thirsting there in the idea of being satisfied. When we hunger and thirst for the right things, we will find satisfaction. So the question is for you, what is your too much? What is the thing in 2024 that you are focused on changing? What are your vices? What do you struggle with? What maybe do you go too far in that you need to peel back? Because for a lot of people, this is going to be a different answer. But gluttony, debauchery, excessive, wasteful, prodigal living, using our things to the extreme, is a problem, whatever aspect of your life that may find for you. So, whatever your too much is, may the Lord bless you with the ability this upcoming year to roll that back and to focus on Him and to find satisfaction in Him and to realize that He is enough. The Lord God is enough. So thanks for your attention this morning. I appreciate it. If there's anyone here this morning who has not yet given your life to the Lord, what better time than the turn of the year? What better time to get started in 2024 being a child of the Lord's to do that this morning? Or if there's anyone here this morning who needs the prayers of this group for help in some way, we'd love to pray for you this morning as well. Please come as we stand and sing.